Which 10 quotations do I think are most important for you to know when thinking about the character Gerald Croft in J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls? Let's find out.
Hey everyone, it's me, Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and if you're watching this video, then it's because you're looking for some quotations about the character Gerald Croft in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls. Well, you've come to the right place, because in this video I am going to provide you with a quick summary of his character, 10 quotations, and then a quick discussion about what I think J.B. Priestley's intentions were when writing this character. Make sure you have a pen and paper out in front of you, as I will be saying a lot of things that won't necessarily be appearing on screen during this video. And of course, if you think that this video is super helpful and you would like to see more content like this, you can let me know by dropping the video a like, commenting on it, and of course subscribing to my channel. Recently I've hit 400 subscribers, and so I guess the race is on to hit 500. Can I do it before the end of the year? So here is my quick summary of Gerald. Mr. Gerald Croft is the son of Sir George and Lady Croft, which links to the next thing we can say about him. He is upper class, certainly higher up than the Burlings are. We will see some evidence for this in just a little bit. Gerald is engaged to Miss Sheila Burling, Mr. and Mrs. Burling's only daughter. I have already analysed her in some detail, and if you want to see that, then click the link that should be appearing on screen about now. Gerald is about 30 years old, which places him somewhere in the middle of Mrs. and Mr. Burling's ages and their children's ages. Although he is obviously closer in age to Sheila and Eric, he also seems to share capitalist views with the older generation, which we'll see in a moment. Certainly, you might want to call him the character who bridges the gap between the two generations. And finally, his involvement with Eva Smith was that he had an affair with her when she went by the name Daisy Renton. He kept her safe and she was happy, which may have given her hope. Because the affair ended, and it was always going to end, you could argue that he took this small glimmer of hope away from her too. Right, so here is the first quotation that I have selected for Gerald. As I did in my 10 quotations for Mr. Burling, a link for which is appearing on screen about now, I will start with the play's opening stage directions. For Gerald, they say, Gerald Croft is an attractive chap about 30, rather too manly to be a dandy, but very much the well-bred young man about town. So these stage directions say that Gerald is too manly to be a dandy. But what is a dandy? Well, a dandy was a Victorian man devoted to fashion, style and neatness. A Victorian metrosexual, if you were. If he is not this, then it might suggest that he is typically masculine, but perhaps a bit too much. Might this hypermasculinity foreshadow the way in which he treats women in the play, and even explain his affair? And here is our second quotation for Gerald. It's a bit long, but I will talk about which sections you could specifically focus on in just a bit. These quotations reveal to the audience Gerald's social class, as when Mr. Burling tells him that he gets the impression that Lady Croft doesn't approve of Gerald's engagement to Sheila, Gerald's response is, Gerald, rather embarrassed, begins to murmur some dissent, but Burling checks him. To which Arthur says, "No, Gerald, that's all right. Don't blame her. She comes from an old country family, landed people and so forth, and so it's only natural. So the particular bit that directly reveals Gerald's class to the audience is that he comes from an old country family, landed people and so forth. In this case, landed people means that they own land, presumably a lot of it, which is a distinction of the upper class, which you would already know if you had watched my contexts video. However, the quotation landed people or old country family is not all that useful for language analysis. You could explain why it shows that he is upper class, but all that would really mean is a factual explanation. Something a bit more interpretive is better, I feel. So why not analyse the stage directions? Rather embarrassed, begins to murmur some dissent. This could show that although he apparently loves Sheila, Gerald is also aware of the fact that he is marrying down, and that his mother disapproves of this. This creates an awkwardness that is born out of class divisions. So, rather embarrassed could show us this awkwardness. But what might begins to murmur some dissent reveal? On one hand, it shows that he does want to defend his relationship with Sheila, but his defence is only a murmur. Perhaps Gerald knows that he shouldn't really be marrying Sheila, or that he doesn't really know why he is marrying her. If he knew why it was right that they marry, surely he would have defended their relationship much more strongly. Anyway, Gerald, he's upper class, he's higher up than the Burlings, and this could be a slight source of tension in the play. We'll see. Here we have our third quotation. When Burling explains that he had to sack Eva Smith for her involvement in the strikes at his factory, Gerald says, "You couldn't have done anything else." Ultimately, this shows that Gerald is siding with Mr. Burling. But why? Let's have a think. On one hand, this could just be him agreeing with his future father-in-law for the sake of forming a strong relationship with him. Certainly, there are times throughout the play where Gerald sucks up to Arthur, and vice versa. However, I think a more interesting, useful and exam-friendly interpretation is that this quotation exemplifies Gerald's capitalist views. Much like how Mr. Burling thinks it is his right to dismiss employees for striking, Gerald's views seem to put money first and people second. This is best seen perhaps by the modal verb couldn't, as the negative form removes any possibility, in Gerald's mind, of Arthur conceivably doing anything else. Our fourth quotation is another that is spoken by a character other than Gerald. Remember, you don't just have to quote Gerald when you're writing about him. Furthermore, I've chosen this quotation as it is an example of what I like to call a hidden stage direction, which is dialogue that makes it clear that a character must act a certain way or do a certain thing. So when Sheila says, "No, not really, it was my own fault," suddenly to Gerald, "All right, Gerald, you needn't look at me like that. At least I'm trying to tell the truth. I expect you've done things you're ashamed of too." We know that Gerald is giving her a bit of a bad look when she confesses to getting Eva sacked from Millward's for looking good in a dress that looked bad on Sheila. Okay, so Sheila might be a bit sensitive when it comes to people giving her looks, but I do not believe that she would react in this way based on absolutely nothing. So why has Gerald given Sheila a funny look? I'll give you three options. Number one, He thinks she is being a silly, over-emotional woman. This is possible as we see later on in the play that he holds some views that could be described as sexist, and so looking down on a woman like this would not necessarily be out of character for him. Number 2. He is shocked at her actions. Although we don't know for certain how their relationship was prior to the events of this play, I would imagine that it would be a shock to find out on the night of your engagement party that your fiancé got somebody thrown out of their job out of pure spite. 3. He is shocked that she feels guilty. As a capitalist, Gerald is more likely to side with the employer and customer than he is the employee. Gerald may feel that the employer made the decision to sack Eva, and therefore their decision is correct, and so Sheila has no need to feel bad. Which of those interpretations do you agree with most, or do you have an alternative yourself? Please do let me know down in the comment section below. Our 5th quotation comes from the end of Act 1. That does mean that half of our quotations have come from the play's first act, but considering that Gerald leaves partway through Act 2 and rejoins partway through Act 3, I think that's about right. So when Sheila questions him about his involvement with Daisy Renton, this is how he responds. First, he does not reply, and then moments later, he does not reply but looks at her. Gerald's inability or refusal to reply is interesting. It could show that he refuses to accept his involvement with Daisy, as it is too painful for him. This is a sympathetic interpretation. On the other hand, it could show that he genuinely thought he could keep his affair secret from everybody, including his fiancée and an apparently omniscient inspector. This interpretation presents him as deceptive and untrustworthy. Regardless, I think this definitely presents him as being dishonest in some way. He is either being dishonest with himself by not confronting the past and the bad things that he has done, or he is being dishonest to others. Our next quotation comes from the very start of Act 2. After Gerald tries to convince Sheila to leave before he is questioned because it is bound to be unpleasant and disturbing, the inspector says, "And do you think young women ought to be protected against unpleasant and disturbing things?" Gerald's response is, if possible, yes, which confirms that he believes what the inspector is saying here. On one hand, you could say that this presents Gerald positively, almost as if he is some sort of hero, as he wants to protect young women from things that are unpleasant. Surely protecting anyone is quite nice, right? Maybe, but maybe not. It only seems to be young women who Gerald wishes to protect, not old women and not men. There's something a bit sexist or patronising about this view, you could claim, as he seems to think that young women are incapable of looking after themselves and that they need some sort of knight in shining armour to look after them. Nowadays we might call this view sexist or patronising, but in 1912 it was seen as more proper, so we could also say that he is exhibiting traditional views instead, which is a bit less critical of him. Here we have 3, that's right, 3, quotations which all come in quick succession. Gerald says each of these things as he's telling the tale of how he first met Eva/Daisy. They all sort of help to create the same overall impression of him, whereas each one individually also creates a distinct impression of Gerald too. So the 3 quotations that we're looking at here are, firstly, "It's a favourite haunt of women of the town." Secondly, I hate those hard-eyed, dough-faced women. And number 3, she looked young and fresh and charming and altogether out of place down there. Together, these show Gerald to be something of a sexist. He is familiar with the location that prostitutes frequent, criticises them, and then only notices Eva/Daisy because of her apparent good looks. Certainly, Gerald does not particularly view women as his equal. On one hand, you could say that this is sexist. On the other, you could say that it was a view that represented the power dynamic between men and women in 1912. But what about those quotations on their own, I hear you cry? Okay, here we go, quick bit of analysis. The first quotation presents the upper-class Gerald as a bit of a degenerate. He is consorting with prostitutes who had a low reputation in 1912. The second quotation shows him to be a bit of a misogynist, a woman hater. He hates these women in particular because they are not attractive. Hard-eyed and dough-faced certainly have negative connotations. Finally, the last quotation, as I hinted at earlier, suggests that he only noticed Eva/Daisy because she is pretty. This might suggest that women only have value in Gerald's eyes if they are physically attractive, which presents him as vain and sexist. Our next quotation comes at the end of Gerald's interrogation. When the inspector declares that he has no more questions for him, Gerald replies by saying, "In that case, as I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear to be, and, well, I'd like to be alone for a while. I'd be glad if you let me go." Based on the language choices in his dialogue, we know that Gerald is upset, but analysing the word upset is not going to result in particularly deep language analysis. Instead, why not look at the punctuation in this quotation instead? Dashes have been used pretty frequently, so what might they show? I argue that as the actor playing Gerald speaks these lines, they would do so with a bit of a pause or stutter whenever there is a dash. Why? Because the dash has been used to represent his emotional state. He is trying very hard to keep himself together and not break down, which results in a bit of a staccato rhythm as he says these lines. In short, the dashes show that he cannot get his words out properly, suggesting that he is upset. And here is our penultimate, which means second last, quotation. It comes much later in the play, once the inspector has gone and Gerald has returned. Gerald says, slowly, "That man wasn't a police officer." So there's a few things we can say about this quotation. First of all, why does he say this line slowly? After all, that is what the stage directions inform us. It could be because he wants everyone to be really clear about what he is saying, or maybe he's trying to have a bit of a show-offy moment. By saying this line slowly, Gerald demands power and attention and status, things that he may have lost earlier in the play, given that when he was last on stage he was over-emotional, hardly the hyper-masculine character that we are led to believe him to be. This show of bravado may be him trying to reclaim the authority that he had at the start of the play. Secondly, why does Gerald know this information, and why does he need to know it? So we find out just moments later that he bumped into a policeman and asked him about Inspector Gould. Fair enough. But why did he need to ask him at all? I argue that it is because Gerald is looking for a way out. Gerald so desperately wants what he learned about Eva/Daisy to be false that he actively sought confirmation that the inspector was a fraud. This could suggest that he was in denial about how he treated Eva/Daisy, or that he refused to accept responsibility for her suicide. That could also explain why he makes such a grand gesture of revealing the inspector's deception to the Burlings. He is both immensely relieved and incredibly excited. He thinks he is free from blame and guilt. And here we have our final quotation for Gerald. They have found out that there is no Inspector Goole and that no girl has died in the infirmary tonight. Mr. and Mrs. Burling are happy, as is Gerald, but Sheila and Eric still feel guilty for their actions. As Sheila excuses herself and starts to go to bed, Gerald says, "Everything's all right now, Sheila," and he holds up the engagement ring. "What about this ring?" Simply put, this quotation shows that Gerald has learned nothing from the evening, because he thinks that everything is okay now. He may have had an affair and lied to his fiancée, but there's going to be no public scandal and nobody's died, so what does it matter, right? In his eyes, he has done nothing wrong, and so the engagement can go ahead after all. This shows that he really does not have any remorse for his actions, as he is continuing as if nothing has happened, as if he didn't have an affair. I find that in particular to be shocking. You could argue that the ring is a symbol of traditional power and also possession. As an upper-class man, he is trying to assert his power over Sheila, as if his poor actions are excusable because he can promise her marital bliss, which will also probably involve him having more affairs. This final depiction of Gerald is disappointing. He clearly cared for Eva/Daisy, and his emotional response to realising that she was dead gave a glimmer of hope that he may go on to become a better man. But this is lost once he thinks his reputation and social standing are no longer at threat. In some senses, you could say that he is worse than Mr. Burling. As I have said in my videos for Arthur and Sheila, it's all well and good being able to remember quotations and their analyses, but you won't get into the top grades if you do not consider the author's intentions. Why did Priestley write Gerald the way he did? In other words, what would be missing from the message of the play if Gerald wasn't in it? As I said at the beginning of the video, Gerald bridges the gap between the two generations of Burlings. Although he is closer to Sheila and Eric in age, he is ideologically closer to Mr. and Mrs. Burling. This makes him quite a complex character, and makes one of Priestley's messages,
that if there is hope, it lies in the younger generation,
more nuanced. Gerald does, of course, have a compassionate side, as he did after all look after Eva/Daisy for some time. But he is also quite self-interested and prioritises the preservation of his own reputation over caring for others. By having him end the play in, I argue, a negative light, Priestley is showing his audience, many of whom would have been around the same age as Gerald were he a real person and alive in 1945, that their generation is capable of behaving just as badly as the one before them. They must make sure that they are not complacent and actively improve their actions. So maybe Priestley wrote Gerald in the way that he did in order to criticise the upper class. Gerald is, after all, the only upper class character we see on stage, and he does not end the play particularly well. As much as the middle class would have had power over the poor, the upper class and the aristocracy, of which Gerald is a member, had the most power in Victorian Britain, and Priestley may have been blaming them for the ills of 1912, class and gender inequality, and the looming First World War. Furthermore, by presenting this young upper-class member in a negative way, Priestley may be suggesting to his audience that it is in fact the middle class's responsibility to correct their wrongs. He may have wanted to motivate his audience to do something and to be better than the upper class. And finally, Priestley may have presented Gerald negatively in order to vilify sexist or misogynist views. Gerald certainly does not treat women as his equal. He has an affair, lies to his fiancée, and even talks snappily to Mrs. Burling, which you can find on page 31. Why might he have wanted to vilify views like this? Well, we must remember that between 1912 and 1945, the years in which the play was set and written, women experienced a rise in status in the UK, caused in part by the two world wars. By dismissing views that look down on women, Priestley highlights and celebrates their increasingly equal status in society. So that's our discussion of Gerald Croft over. But what could you do next? Well, aside from liking the video, dropping a comment on it, and subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, you could make a graph that depicts how he is presented across the play. I've got a y-axis that goes from positive presentation to negative presentation, and an x-axis that marks the progression of the play, basically from start to finish. On this, I would plot a number of quotations, say the number equal to my GCSE target grade. I'd mark with an X, write the quotation, and also a brief bit of analysis that explains how the quotation presents Gerald and why this is positive or negative. If I was looking for the very top grades too, I might even include a bit about Priestley's intentions. So if I've done all of that, it might end up looking a bit like that. Now, obviously, I've done this pretty randomly, and I haven't done all of the analysis, but that's because it's just meant to illustrate what you could do, and there's no point in me putting all of my ideas down on this, because then it would just be too easy for you to copy it. So make your own mind up, put down some of your own ideas, and so on. Making a graph like this is useful because it can show you a character's high and low points, which might be things that you would want to talk about in an essay. Anyway, that's it from me. Well done for watching the whole video. I really do hope that it has helped you with your revision and that you're feeling more confident when tackling this text now. If you are revising, please do remember to take frequent short breaks, as a burned out student is not a happy or successful student. And if you've watched my video, I think those are two things that you definitely deserve to be.
So those were the 10 or so quotations that I think are most useful for you to know about the character Gerald Croft. But which quotation do you think is the most important? Please do let me know down in the comment section below. Anyway, that's this video over, and I do hope, as ever, that you have an awesome rest of the day. Cheers.